story. You're going to hear it again because my mum used to tell me the story all the time. He takes his last tract in the Treasury Gardens in Melbourne. He spikes it on the picket fence. Some people say he rolled it into a seat. Whichever way, he leaves his last tract and he says, here, someone read that. He trudges home. He's done. Another guy, also a Miller, not William Miller, it's already. This is another Mr. Miller, picks up the tract. He ran a debating society in South Melbourne. That's what you did before television and the internet. And they debated topics. He's reading about the Sabbath. And he's saying, what a great topic. He tracks down Corliss, knocks on the door in High Street, Richmond. Did you write this? He goes, well, yeah, I've distributed that. Can you come to our debating society on Thursday night? This is a great topic for debate. Can you coach the team that's talking about Saturday Sabbath? And he goes there to the debating society. They do the debate. They then study the Bible until the early hours of the morning. Of that debating society, the South Melbourne Debating Society, 17 people in that society became the first Adventist congregation in Australia, North Fitzroy Church. They don't know the first building, but they were the first congregation. My mum used to tell us, just put your tract on the picket fence anyway, because God is at work. And when you're at your least, God can be at his most. And a willing heart with a tract on a picket fence can plant a church. It can start a whole movement in Australia. So Haskell, he's out of here already, by the way. Why is Haskell gone? Because he's back to New Zealand. Why? They're smarter people, yes. And on the way, he's dropping signs of the times in bottles over the side of the ship. I'm not sure the environmental impact of that, but that's what he's doing. And he gets there and comes into Auckland Harbour, and the captain of the ship had said, hey, go to my friend, Edward here. He's got a boarding house in Turner Street. Here's a little note recommending stay in the boarding house. He goes there, he meets Edward, and he gets a room. Everyone likes him. But at night time, they heard this clicking sound late into the hours of the night. It'd be click, 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 and he talked to himself. Other people in the boarding house said, hey, we like that guy here, but at night time, there's this strange clicking, and he just talks to himself. So Edward sneaks up to the door and listens. And he hears Stephen Haskell praying for the people of Auckland, praying for the people of New Zealand, that they might come to know Jesus, praying for each person individually in the boarding house. And then the clicking. The next day, Edward comes back and said, hey, no, this is what's happened. I snuck up and I heard the prayers. But what's the clicking? And he gets to see the very first typewriter in New Zealand. In fact, Edward here owned the second typewriter in New Zealand. And Haskell takes a page out of the typewriter, passes it to Edward and said, this is what this machine does. But what was written was once again talking about the Sabbath. Edward says, hey, my family up in Kaya would be very interested in this, not just the typewriter, but in what you're typing. So they head up there and he meets Joseph here. Joseph here has, I think it was 11 kids at that stage. He planted his own church up there with just having so many children. And that church, that's another strategy, by the way, Wayne, just have lots of kids. That church became the first Adventist church in New Zealand. What's the point of this? You can have the best technology to use for God's glory, use it. Some of you are very clever with computers and some of you are very clever with all kinds of technology that I can't get my head around. Use it. But prayer is always the key. And when we heard Jamison just before talking about prayer, that always matters. So, a few other stories, as I say, the children's books, but grab them to ABC because that one there, I'm not going to tell the story, but that's a big traction engine that was supposed to be going up to Broken Hill to Cartweed and never made it because they forgot the Murray River was in the middle and they couldn't get across any of the bridges. All the bridges were too small. Absolute failure. You can still see this thing at Redcliffs on the Calder Highway. Failure for doing what it was meant to do. But as they trudged up all the way to the Murray, every Sabbath they stopped and had worship services on this great big thing. And the farmers came and joined them and they planted churches. The church I grew up in, Denton Church, is Testament started with bottrels. So what can be a failure can be ideal for church planting. This guy here, Joseph Steed, I owned a paint and decorating business in Adelaide, and recently I was in Adelaide and I went down to where his shop had been and just to try and catch the aura of... I owned a paint and decorating business, incredibly successful, His wife becomes an Adventist from Corliss's mission, by the way, when Corliss went to Adelaide after Melbourne. He doesn't become an Adventist for another 3 years. When he does, he gets so obsessed with it that he decides that he's going to give his life to this. He rode a bike from Adelaide to Broken Hill, planting churches along the way. Then he gets this pedal boat. It wasn't a paddle boat, a paddle steamer. It was a pedal boat. We had to pedal it. And he pedaled along the lower half of the Murray, planting churches. The Murray Bridge Church is there because he convinced the paddle steamer captain, Broderick, to give the land to build a church. And planting churches along the lower Murray is this guy, just pedaling his pedal boat along the river. He also went across, he's the first guy to plant churches in Samoa, by the way, if anyone is interested in the Samoan story. So, incredible things by people who are just doing their thing. And incredible stories, and all of us get the opportunity to write a page in this story of God's big mission and what that looks like in Australia, New Zealand, whichever part of the planet you end up serving God in. So, that stays the same. Prayer, God's work, God working in and through people, that stays the same. Angel Set Australia, that stays the same. We've still got a mission we're called to. What's the changing context that we're in? That's what I want to look at for a moment now. I forgot to send you some pictures. But you've probably researched some of this, and some of you will have looked at cultural context. Even if you haven't, you're living here so you know it. We live in what we might call, and I like Zygmunt Bauman's description, he says we're in liquid modernity. Zygmunt Bauman, who's a Polish-British sociologist, passed away, 2 years ago. I think he has some of the most insightful ideas on how society has worked and progressed. And I think some of the insights he gives us are really useful for the church. So Zygmunt Bauman, he doesn't believe in postmodernism. What do you mean by that? Let me describe it. He says we lived in a culture, and he calls modernism a solid culture. He said we lived in this solid environment where our institutions were very stable. Coming out of Industrial Revolution, we had very set ways of knowing what was right and what was wrong, and who was authority and who wasn't, and how our culture was meant to work, for good and for bad. But he said it was very set. You knew who you were, everyone else who knew who you were, and you stayed in your position, in your station in life, and that's the culture we lived in. Oversimplification, but that was modernism. He then said, and he calls that solid, he then said we went to liquid. What's he mean by that? So he's not saying that postmodernism is a reaction to modernism. He's saying that what happened next was just modernism heated up. He thinks it was heated up by consumerism of all things, and we can talk about consumerism another day. But he says consumerism comes along and heats up modernism to shape what he calls this liquid modernity, where it no longer fits as nicely into the package, where we're not so sure anymore, where we want a bit more freedom to move, where we want different ways of expressing who we are as a culture, where we don't want to be in the fixities that we had in modernism, where we're not so sure of the institutions anymore, and we don't even know if we trust the institutions anymore, and we're not so sure of our government anymore, and if our government tells us what to do, we're not so sure if we're going to do it anymore. So it's now liquid, and it's now not fitting into the boxes quite so well. Before he passed away, his last material was writing on how we'd turn into a gas. He goes, as a culture, we've turned into a gas. What's he mean by that? He says we've moved beyond, but he says we haven't changed the elements that make us up, which is why he disagrees with those constructs that's modernism, postmodernism. He said it hasn't actually changed the elements. He said we're still made of the same stuff. He says it's heated up again. What's heating it up? What heats up our culture? He says consumerism. Consumerism heats up our culture, finds new ways to express in social media and electronic media, finds new ways of expressing this consumer dream. And he says that heats our culture up even more, makes us more individual, makes us less collective, makes us less likely to want to identify with a bigger story and a bigger group, makes me more likely to want to create my own story and try on different identities. Where I had a fixed identity back here, I'm now trying on different lives. And I can take a life, take an identity, put it on, take it off, put it back on the shelf, and try several different identities in the same project, in the same period of life. And so he's saying we're now gas. We don't want to fit a shape anymore. I don't want to be defined by who I am. I don't want to be defined what I am biologically. We don't want to be male, female. We don't want to be one thing or another thing. We don't want to fit into the box anymore. And whether you agree with Zygmunt Bauman or not, and that's a whole fun thing to discuss, he does make the point that we've now got to an increasingly individual culture. There's upsides and downsides. Some of the limitations, now I'm going to talk about some of the exciting things. Some of the limitations is I do it my way. I have my truth. And Shaylee, you can have your truth. And anyone in here, Sarah can have her truth, but it's your truth. And you don't have to, it doesn't have to be consistent. It doesn't even have to be internally consistent. Because it's my truth. And if it's my truth, then I'm going to do that. So we have this individual way of looking at it. We have this way of, I'll build my life story how I want to. As I say, upsides and challenges. But it also means I disconnect from the wider stories of us, whether that be history, whether that be a culture's religiosity. I disconnect from those to create my story. And you're already thinking, hey, there's some opportunities here and some challenges. We end up with this pluralistic society where there's not one big story holding us together anymore. There's lots and lots of little stories. There's lots and lots of me stories. It creates this individualism. Intriguingly, what's that do for us? Disconnection from the larger story, distrust of institutions and authority, post-truth, we talk about that often. There's a cynicism, an underlying cynicism of any of the structures that used to hold us together, and a deregulation of spirituality. Once again, remember there's upsides and challenges. Once again, this is oversimplifying. Keeping in mind, we're still humans. We still have the need for relationship, even though we've individualized, even though consumerism destroys community, even though as consumerism goes up, connection goes down. Deregulation of spirituality, what's that mean? The Centre for Secular Post-Christian Mission has existed since the 80s, by the way. And originally it was more of an academic focus before it turned into a more practical focus. And I was reading the original books that James Coffin edited on secularism. In the 80s, the general view was, and it was talking about how bad television is and how that was changing us, but the general view was secularism was going to sweep through Western culture. It was going to increase our dependence on scientific rationalism, that we were going to have less room for the mystical expressions of our culture, that we're going to be less likely to think that there's something beyond what we can explain in front of us through scientific rationalism. That's what they thought secularism was going to do. It was going to, and the sentence I liked, it was going to vacuum out the spirituality from our culture. Is that what happened? Did spirituality get vacuumed out of our culture? And for a while it looked like that was what was happening, because you can point to data, and you still can, saying less people are identifying with Christianity, less people are identifying with religious institutions, less people are attending church. We'll come back to that in a moment. What's happened? Philip Hughes has written a fascinating article on the spiritual but not religious. And Philip Hughes maintains that in Australia, we're more spiritual than ever. Gary Balmer, who's now passed away as well, Melbourne University, says the same thing as he analyses religion in Australia. He said, we're more spiritual than ever. He says, we're making more room for the mystical. Philip Hughes maintains in his article that, in actual fact, COVID made us less reliant on science and opened our skepticism to science and made us even more open to all kinds of other ways of experiencing. So, more spiritual than ever, just not connected to a faith community. What is it? It's an individualized spirituality where I'll take a little bit from Oprah and a little bit from the Dalai Lama, and I'll take a little bit from the pastor on Sabbath, and I'll take a little bit from a bumper sticker, and I'll take a little bit from everywhere. And I'll create my own spirituality. There's a shop in Sassafras in Melbourne. It's called Oracles of Sassafras. Sassafras is up in the Dandenongs. Fascinating shop. Why? Because you can walk into that shop. Graham, you've been up to Sassafras. You can walk into that shop and you can buy yourself a menorah if you want. You can buy yourself a little Buddha if you want. You can buy yourself some tarot cards if you want. Right next to, strangely, you can still buy an Amy Grant CD. Obviously, that hasn't sold for a very long time. You can buy yourself a Bible next to a Quran, next to all kinds of stuff. And it is stuff. It's just paraphernalia of the spiritual. It's incompatible. And I'm standing there looking at this shop thinking, previous generations have fought wars over this stuff. But here you can buy both things in the same purchase. The category of the spiritual is just grab the bits you want to shape the spirituality you want. Strangely, and I should have put the picture here, but because I took a photo of it because I thought this was bizarre. Big W at Lilydale, of all places, near the checkouts in that spot where you buy all the junk stuff at the last moment. It had these angel cards. I thought, that's really nice, these angel cards. Well, what's an angel card do? Right next to it was a box of tarot cards from the same publisher. And I'm looking at it going, somewhere someone has commodified spirituality really well and turned it into a product to be sold with no thought about what stories did it grow out of, with no thought about what's it mean, internal consistency, what's it shaping. It's just, here's another piece of spiritual bricolage to add to your spiritual collection. So, and we can keep talking about that, but I'll keep moving on, because what it causes is a disengagement from denominations, because the denomination, I choose what I want, and as soon as you disagree with me, guess what? I'm out of here. So we have a disengagement with denominations. This is the challenge, because here's the exciting part. Let me do some exciting things. Well, this bit's not exciting. This is sad. The exciting part's coming next. This is 84% of Australians. This is NCLS research last year. And Tim O'Neill's been presenting this, Wayne. Wayne is the president of Exponential, and Tim works with Wayne. 84% of Australians are not part of a faith community, which would mean 84% of Australians are not connecting with the operating system that we operate our faith community on. Not just Adventists. This is religious institutions entirely. That's the challenge. Because the angel still says Australia. Australia has a spiritual, is it emptiness? Is it a spiritual aspect of its culture? And I think this deregulation, in fact, is a huge opportunity because people are no longer fixed in their spot. Intriguingly, NCLS research from last year, we might come back to that if we get time. Last year, the least religious, the least likely to engage in institutional religion in Australia are the 50 to 64-year-olds. And as Ruth Powell points out, they're the group that are basically controlling the media narrative about the church at the moment. They're the least likely to engage with a religious community. Sometimes we're beat up on the younger generations, but guess what? And I didn't put the slide in. The next slide was going to be the group that is increasingly likely, 1 in 3, is 20 to 30-year-olds to engage in a religious faith community. Is that exciting? Yeah, because as we become increasingly post-Christian, the people who beat up on the Christian church, the people who decide the Christian church was something I'm disengaged from, often for good reasons, by the way. The atheism we see expressed in our culture is a healthy reaction to the God that was posted in, the God that was presented in an earlier period where it was a cruel, arbitrary, vengeful judge. They've reacted against that, Philip Hughes says, they were inoculated against the Christian institution by attending private schools, where they got just enough of a vengeful God who was disciplining them to keep them disconnected and say, I've tried it, but it doesn't work. So that inoculated group, they're the 50 to 64-year-olds now. They're moving through the system. And this next bunch are coming along. And guess what? They haven't got that baggage. And guess what? They're open in their quest for what they're looking for. And here's the cool thing. Guess what? They're increasingly isolated, disconnected, but they're reacting against that and looking for places where they can connect. That's the exciting part, because guess who's going to be leading and dreaming and praying for and creating those places? It's Vic Graham's job. It's us. If you have an inkling of being called to leading a community of faith, then that is the agency on our planet at the moment that is for the salvation of souls, and you and I get to be part of that. So, head across to Europe, where they're further down this road than we've been, and hopefully we're able to use the jigsaw puzzles we still have at our disposal to reframe who we are before we get to that. Head across to Europe, and Wayne, and I'm pointing to Wayne because he and I were in Helsinki, and you turn up at a church that's in a house. Well, it's in a house and another house, because the neighbour who didn't want them there, first of all, and built a fence to keep these young people out of his house, now has pulled down the fence. And when they split for groups, you go across to his yard and his kitchen. It's young people who Europe moves to post-Christian and disengages from the institution. But that was that bunch. Amongst young people, there's a revival of what it looks like to be a Christian community. And as Wayne and I trot around the place looking at some of this, I was just inspired by young people without all that baggage who are going, what's it look like to connect in relationships and create biblical communities? And I would like to think the most exciting times for the Christian community in Australia are just there. Why? Because unshackled from that baggage, the institutional baggage that probably needed unshackling in many aspects, there's a freedom of expression. It might be a gas, but amongst that gas, there's God's children. And there's people who still crave community. And there's people who still crave what it looks like to belong to something bigger than me. And there's still people, God is still working in that gas. And we join God on that mission to connect with lives like Vikram does, like Jamison does, like we're all called to be and do. And so, as we talk about secular post-Christian mission, I think the most exciting times for the church are in a spot where there's a freedom to create new ways of being community. Finishing up with this idea, we'll skip that for a moment because that was interesting, but that's really interesting, but we're going to skip that too. So what are we doing about this? So you're going to hear more about Church Next. Church Next is conversations, and the little X is meant to be that little part on your keyboard where you press next. Conversations about where the Adventist Church in Australia is up to and going to. That's why it's got the little orange square that's the square of the logo, but it's thinking beyond the square, going upward. Bringing administrators together, presidents, CFOs, secretaries. Why? Because they're the ones that have a lot to say in how we create an environment of domination. What's it look like for a denomination to, in an anti-institutional environment, actually work in ways that support the organic expressions of church? Can we do it? I think we can. What's that look like? We're just trying to generate the right conversation with administrators. That'll include some of the leaders. It'll end up including all kinds of people, all kinds of levels, talking about what's it look like to be a biblical community in the cultural context we're in. And you'll be part of that conversation because it's a conversation we all need to be part of, because some things change, some things stay the same. You can go from solid to liquid to gas, but there's still a God of the universe. There's still Angel Says Australia. There's still people God calls to mission. There's still 84% of Australia who need you to plant a church or lead a church that engages in community. And there's still people like you who respond to the greatest calling on the planet to give up their lives to reach the lives of others. It matters. What you're doing matters. As you study and get equipped, as you think about church, as you get skills, as you get all those tools in your tool bag, it's going to be exciting to see what God does in and through the people in this room. Because I think the most exciting part for church planting is here.
Okay, sorry. Don't go anywhere. Are there any questions for our esteemed guest? Comments? Up the back. Have you got a microphone? Probably. If you could talk to the PA guy. What's his name again? Because Wendy, what's his name? Sorry, throw her under the bus. You can turn it on. Doing that. If you stick around for this afternoon's program, it's actually going to be handed out after I talk. So that's why we're not handing it out now. We want you to stick around. This is probably the best book on church planting I know of. And if you don't have a copy, if you've got a copy, that's great. If you don't, you'll get a free copy of this, the church planting journey. It's a step-by-step process for planting a church. And there are different segments to it. So you can look at the whole vision section. You can look at all the steps in it, things like that. So that is going to be a free gift that's going to be handed out as you leave. But question number one for Bill President.
So I got the mic working now. Sorry. So it's on your topic of spiritual individualism. You were saying that people pick and choose their spirituality. Why do they do that?
I'm so glad you asked, Andrew. Why do they do that? It's out in front as well. So why do people pick and choose their own spirituality? To give it in a nutshell, I blame consumerism for everything. Realizing that we had dysfunctions before consumerism. So selfishness, consumerism is simply institutionalized selfishness. But consumerism teaches me from an early age, and Tim Kasser, a psychologist, does a whole lot of research on this, it teaches me to commodify products, experiences, people, and things. And so in the ability to commodify, I choose what products I add to my identity to then shape who I'm going to be. So we see religion as another product to be used to shape identity. So I'll grab these identity signifiers, and he talks about how consumerism has managed to commodify religion. So it takes the tokens of a religiosity and makes those tokens, gives them a different story to the one they're extracted from. So I can grab all these tokens to add to my identity and then shape which identity is going to work for me. As Tim Kasser talks about, he says we can try those identities on and take them off. As he talks about, he says, you can have a young person come to you after a church service, move to tears, but then that night do things exactly different to what they learned that morning because they've put your church service in the category of entertainment. They've taken that bit for the moment, but now they're in a different category. We can move between identities really quick. Religion becomes another branded token to add to identity. That's a huge oversimplification, Andrew. And your question deserves a much better answer. That's the huge oversimplification. Samuel Bakayoko used to always say, read my book. I could send you a PhD that Wendy's read because Wendy was the supervisor for.
She had to read it?
She had to read it. Do you know, I felt sorry for them. My less diplomatic supervisor, because I had two supervisors, so the primary supervisor at Wendy's Secondary, he used to say, Brendan, what you write between 2 and 4 a.m. in the morning is either really good or absolute rubbish. And Wendy used to wade through the good and the rubbish.
And you still got it.
Yeah, I think if you hang around long enough, they just go.
Yes, question here.
As you're describing the progression from solid to liquid to gas, do you think there's also a correlation between the increasing degree of consumerism and mental health issues or things like dissociation? That's all.
Okay. Did I mention I blame consumerism for everything? And so, yes, there is that aspect. Do I think our current focus on mental health is actually pointing out the hollowness of consumerism? I like to think so. I like to think as a society we're getting better at this rather than worse. I'm not one of those societies going down the drain people at the moment, because I think as we talk about mental health, we're realizing there's a different way of being human. And you're seeing that more and more. I think we've reached peak consumerism, I'd like to think. I think there's smarter, younger generations in my generation who are working out how to do this better why I think there's openings for church community, because we're realizing that as we've lost community, we've increased things like mental health challenges. Once again, oversimplification, because there's lots of factors involved, but we're realizing that this emphasis on production is actually undermining well-being rather than the dream, which was supposed to be, my well-being is connected to how much I produce. We're realizing that's not the case. So I think you're onto a really important point.
Can I ask another question? For people in a consumerist society, where they've even commoditized themselves,
Yep.
And they have so many different ideas that are even inconsistent. Do you see any challenges or any approaches to reaching people who, when faced with some solid truth or some single truth, they have to forfeit all of these parts of themselves, or that they've held to identify themselves with?
Do you know what? This is partly a question last night that Wendy was asked as well, talking about, hey, we turn ourselves into a commodity to engage people, because if we don't turn ourselves into a commodity as an Adventist institution, people won't engage. But once you've got them, do you leave them as commodifying everything? I think within Adventism, there's ways of being Adventist that grow us beyond consumerism, whether that be the experience of the Sabbath and what that points to as consumerism. Keeping in mind, anything can be commodified, including the Sabbath. So you can get commodified Sabbath, or you can get Sabbath that goes beyond. The sanctuary, God with us, as we have a better picture of God with. The opposite to consumerism is not anti-consumerism, because that gets commodified. The opposite to consumerism is relationship, and that's a with part. And so as an Adventist church, as we get relationship right and simply be with, as we point people to a God who wants to be with, I think at the very heart, consumerism is a religious disposition. We only address it by a better imagination of a religious disposition, and that is a better picture of a with God. So it's, as I say, there's lots of stuff in one little part, but as we have a more relational God, that's where we can build a more relational imagination. And if we can, consumerism is simply an imagination that's captured our culture. We're seeing the hollowness of it. As we create a better Adventist imagination, I think we can put together systems that people can live within and find some solid aspects of being in a relational community. Make sense?
Love the word with. That's one of my most favorite words when we talk about God. Just thinking about commodifying of religious experience and, you know, how people cherry pick what they want for themselves. How does that vary between different cultural groups? Is this like a Western sort of phenomenon? Is this, how would that affect our Pacific Island or our Indigenous people, or, you know, different cultural groups around the world?
Excellent question, Neil. And I've only just started exploring more of this for our Church Next consultation coming up, because as an Adventist church, we're the second most multicultural denomination in Australia as far as the cultures we're made up of. What's that mean? One reality is you only have to be a generation in a Western culture and you're as consumer driven as anybody. The other reality is you only have to have a mobile phone, and pretty soon you're going to be as consumer driven as anybody. So we drift to that consumerism really quickly. And under that, regardless of what culture, because consumerism is able to commodify culture really well. It will be expressed in my Samoan tattoo. It'll be expressed in my Argentinian soccer shirt. I'll express my culture and tokens of my culture, but underneath it all, I'm driven by the same consumerism that's causing those expressions. So you'll see the cultural expressions, but it's still a commodified experience of that expression. And so it's still the same aspect of community that's going to address it, or underlying that, when I say community, it's a biblical community that has God as the with God aspect that then is the glasses you view culture within. So you're still going to see lots of cultures, but you're going to see the tokens of the culture, which you already see. You'll see the tokens of the culture rather than the actual culture, because it's still the same commodification underlying all of it.
Brendan, I'm not sure whether... I've got two questions. Are you familiar with Carl Trueman's The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self?
Certainly am, yes.
Okay. So this is my question then. How do you think his material relates to, I think it was Borman that you mentioned, you know, the solid liquid gas?
Trueman actually refers to Borman in his book, because I was flicking through going, is Borman in here? Because Trueman, very clever stuff. And he's right about where the self has got to and what that is and what that isn't. Tim Kasser makes Truman very readable because sometimes you can get lost in Truman. So I think Truman would agree that we've lost the structures of it. Now, Truman has a different way of constructing how we got there and what that means. But for both Bauman and Truman, it's only going to be changed by another disposition. And that's a relationship with ultimate being for Truman. But even Bauman, who's not religious, is still saying there has to be something ultimate beyond this system if we're going to make sense of it. That answers the question?
You talk about the different phases of human history from modernism. I think AI is bringing a new aspect to the whole thing. In AI now, we become more individuals. Instead of phoning my good friend to hear about Ellen White, I can go on Ellen White ChatGPT and check things about Ellen White. But but the same goes to legal medicine. There are AIs linked to that. Same with paintings. The question is, isn't AI giving the church another chance? Because as we live in an individualistic society more and more, the need for human connection becomes greater.
Two things. First of all, my son wrote me a very heartfelt Father's Day card until I walked into his room and saw his computer screen, ChatGPT, write a heartfelt Father's Day card for my dad. And so that's when I realized, hey, this really isn't coming out of a heartfelt, we've subcontracted that. And I've got a friend who asked for some insights into an essay they were writing, and one of the lecturers here at Avondale, she's studying at Avondale, your question was, grab an AI-generated version of this answer, this is on pastoral burnout, grab an AI-generated version and compare to analyze what's right or wrong, which means you couldn't just do an AI essay. So whoever wrote that question I thought that was brilliant, that you just went, hey, take the AI, now analyze it. Analyzing AI, is it an opportunity? I think there's all kinds of opportunities. Technology, like a typewriter, can be good, can be bad. I firmly believe Haskell, which is why I told that story at the start, grabbed the technology he had at his disposal, which was a typewriter, and leveraged it for the gospel. Can it be leveraged for gospel? Yes. Can it make us more individual? Also yes, because it feeds back a lot of what you keep asking it. But reality is, any of these technologies, I think technology can be used for great good. It can also, and you can find plenty of books saying how it's going to destroy us, and maybe it will, but it can be used for great good. At the end of it all, it keeps coming back to, we're still humans who crave relationship. And AI is not going to take over, well, some people think it will take over relationship. AI is not going to be able to, you can't commodify genuine relationship. You can try and make brands that try and model that. You can try and make pseudo communities. You can't take over, whether it be by technology, genuine community, genuine relationship. And I think our culture is becoming more open to genuine relationship, despite everything else is dragging us the other way. I think we're seeing more and more of the shortcomings of where that goes to. And can we end up with a culture that gets the best out of that? Can we end up with a church that takes the best of our technology to make us a better community? I hope so.
Thank you. Another question.
I would just like to know something more about Church Next project. So is it yes, yeah, we don't have enough time, but I was just thinking, is it another parallel structure to the institution that we already have? Do we need a structure, or is just as Spirit leads? Is it some center of influence that are going to be organized? And yeah.
Excellent questions. Reality is, at the moment, it's just saying, let's have the conversations about what's it look like for the denomination to be able to support more organic expressions of church. Does that result in structures within structures or structures behind side structures? Possibly, yes. I don't know. Can the structure create some of the organic unstructure that is able to support and be nimble enough to make work, which is where biblical community is going to happen in all sorts of creative ways. Can we do that? Can we find our way through some of the things that can hold us back as structure goes? As Wendy pointed out, yes, we need structure, just like you need your skeleton. You don't want to see your skeleton, but you need your skeleton. And we need structure, but can that structure work in ways that allow mission to be accomplished? What we're doing is we're not going and saying, here's the answer. We're going in and saying, here's the challenge. This is based on Europe. This is where we see the trajectory going if we continue down the same track. We don't need to, because we've got these jigsaw puzzle pieces that God's given us. Let's think, what's it look like if you're a president, if you're a treasurer, if you're a secretary, if you're a leader in our system, what's it look like to create environments where people who are planting churches can thrive and not have the system squash? What's it look like to be able to make enough space to innovate and even fail, which is what Sanitarium do extremely well. They innovate and they go, oh, we thought that was going to work, it didn't. Let's move on and learn from that and do something else. What's it look like to create a learning culture, innovative culture? What's it look like to be a denomination that's able to enhance organic community? Can we do it? So the questions you're asking are the very questions that we'll be having conversations about. But it's an attempt to say, let's take the jigsaw puzzle pieces we've got and see if we can leverage them for the most missional potential in Australia at the moment, so our operating system is able to connect with the 84% of people who don't connect with our current operating system for whatever reasons. That's a really vague answer, because the questions still, you've got the right questions, we haven't got the answers yet.
First meeting is May next year.
Yeah.
Okay, Shay, you'll need to come down the front so they can see you on the Zoom.
They don't need to see me though.
They do.
Not really. They're not here to eat lunch.
There is a interesting book, if any of you are interested, by Jonathan Haidt. It's just come out a couple of months ago, talking about depression amongst teenagers, and he, as a non-Christian psychologist, can track the issue of consumerism and particularly smartphones, and show the increase of depression amongst teens. Secular young people, it's like this. Christians, a little bit under. Jewish young people, less. And one of the things he comes out with, the reason the Jewish teenagers have less depression is because they don't use smartphones on Saturday. It's a Jewish thing where they have this weird idea about a Sabbath rest. And so they have community, and Christians have community, which helps with the lowering of depression. But they can track, the data is showing just how much that has influenced the growing epidemic of depression amongst young people today. That was me just showing how he's not the only smart one around the place. Okay.
Did we give you that book at advisory?
No.
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm glad you read it.
Yeah. It's on my desk. Shay.